I revoked his access card while he was still talking, and watched the room realize, before he did, that he was finished. The system blinked once. Red where it had always been green. Security didn't move yet, but their posture changed. He kept gesturing toward the presentation screen, mid-sentence, still believing he controlled the room. I felt nothing but a settled clarity. This wasn't anger. It was a correction. I hadn't planned to enjoy it, and I didn't. But I also didn't look away. If you're drawn to stories about patience, power, and the quiet dismantling of arrogance, you might find what comes next worth your time. Because what happened in that boardroom didn't start there. It started 3 years earlier, in a moment so small I almost missed it. I was a secretary then. Executive assistant, technically, but the distinction only mattered on paper. My name was Elena Ward, and I worked for a man named Grant Holloway in a mid-rise corporate building in a city that prided itself on being too busy to notice anything unless it broke loudly. Grant was executive vice president of growth initiatives. I scheduled his meetings, filtered his calls, managed his calendar with the kind of precision that made his life frictionless. He didn't thank me for it. People rarely thank you for being invisible. I didn't mind. I liked systems. I liked knowing that if I did my job well, everything else could function smoothly. I took pride in being reliable, the kind of person people trusted without having to think about it. I believed, genuinely, that competence would protect me. That belief lasted exactly 2 years and 8 months. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday. I arrived at 7:30, as always, to prepare Grant's schedule before he came in at 9. There was an email waiting in my inbox, forwarded from his account. It was a meeting confirmation for that afternoon, one I hadn't scheduled. The subject line read, "Restructure discussion, confidential." I opened it. For attendees: Grant, 2 board members, and someone from HR I'd never worked with before. No explanation. No context. Just a calendar block that bypassed me entirely. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the email and continued with my morning tasks. It was possible he'd arranged it himself. Unlikely, but possible. He hated managing his own calendar, but perhaps this was sensitive enough that he'd made an exception. I told myself that. I almost believed it. He arrived at 9:15, coffee in hand, already on his phone. He didn't look at me as he passed my desk. "Morning, Elena." "Good morning. I saw the meeting at 2, do you need anything prepared for it?" He paused mid-step, just briefly, then shook his head. "Already handled. Thanks." He disappeared into his office. The door clicked shut. I sat very still. Already handled meant someone else had handled it. Someone else had access to his calendar, his priorities, his confidential meetings. And I, who had organized his professional life for nearly 3 years, had been quietly stepping around. I didn't panic. I didn't spiral. I returned to my work and decided to pay closer attention. The meeting happened. I watched Grant leave at 1:50, jacket on, expression unreadable. He returned 90 minutes later, spoke briefly to someone on the phone in his office, then left early without a word. The next morning, I checked the shared drive. There was a new folder I didn't have access to. It was titled 2024 Operational Transition, and when I clicked on it, I got a permissions error. I noted the timestamp. It had been created the day before, at 3:47 p.m., right after his meeting. I leaned back in my chair and stared at my screen. I didn't ask him about it. Asking would have required assuming I had the right to know, and I'd already begun to suspect that right had been quietly revoked. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I kept working. I stayed calm. I waited. 2 weeks later, I was sitting at my desk when a woman I didn't recognize walked past me and into Grant's office without knocking. I stood. "Excuse me, do you have an appointment?" She glanced back at me, smiled briefly. I'm Rachel. I'll be working with Grant on a few projects. Then she closed the door. I sat back down, pulse ticking unevenly in my throat. Rachel Penner. I looked her up in the directory. Executive consultant. No direct reporting line. Hired externally, contract basis, starts date listed as 2 weeks prior, the same day as that confidential meeting. No one had told me. Grant's door opened 20 minutes later. Rachel emerged first, folders in hand, laughing at something he'd said. He followed her out, still talking. I'll have Elena send over the files you need, he said. She nodded. Perfect. They both looked at me. I met his gaze, kept my voice even. Which files? The tenant contracts from last quarter, he said. Rachel's reviewing our lease structures. Of course. I'll send them this afternoon. Thanks. He turned back to Rachel. Let me walk you out. They left together. I heard the elevator chime. I pulled up the contracts, attached them to an email, and sent them to Rachel's address. Then I sat back and let myself feel it, just for a moment. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was confused. Because tenant contracts weren't part of growth initiatives. They fell under operations compliance. My division. The one I'd been quietly building expertise in for 3 years, managing the tedious, invisible work that kept the building legally sound and operationally stable. And no one had asked me. I looked at the email I'd just sent. Rachel's auto-reply appeared almost immediately, thanks. I'll review and circle back. I closed my laptop. That night, I stayed late. Not because I had work to finish, but because I wanted to see who else was still in the building. Grant's office was dark by 6. Rachel's name didn't appear on the after-hours access log. But there was another name I didn't recognize. Damon Cross. VP of Strategic Assets. I frowned. I'd heard the title before but never met him. He worked remotely, mostly, and his visits to the building were rare. But according to the log, he'd been here last Thursday. And the Thursday before that. I pulled up his employment file. He'd been hired 5 months ago. I hadn't been told. I shut down my computer, gathered my coat, and took the elevator down in silence. The lobby was empty except for the night security guard, Marco, who nodded at me as I passed. Late night, Ms. Ward? Just catching up. He smiled. You work too hard. I returned the smile, pushed through the glass doors, and stepped into the cold. The air bit at my face, sharp and clarifying. I walked 3 blocks before I realized I wasn't heading toward the subway. I was just walking. Trying to think. Trying to understand what I already knew but hadn't wanted to name. I was being phased out. Not fired. Not yet. But slowly, methodically edited out of the systems I'd helped build. My access narrowed. My awareness is limited. Decisions made in rooms I wasn't invited to, by people I'd never met. And Grant, who I had worked beside, supported, trusted, hadn't said a word. I stopped walking. The street was quiet. A few cars passed. Somewhere a dog barked. I stood there, coat pulled tight, and felt something inside me shift. Not rage. Not heartbreak. Just clarity. I had been loyal. I had been competent. I had believed that would matter. It hadn't. But I wasn't going to explain myself. I wasn't going to beg for transparency or demand a seat at a table I'd already been removed from. I was going to pay attention. And I was going to remember everything. I turned and walked back toward the subway, hands in my pockets, breath misting in the frozen air. The next morning, I arrived early again. I made Grant's coffee the way he liked it, updated his calendar, answered emails with the same efficiency I always had. When he walked in, I smiled. Good morning. Morning, Elena. He didn't look at me. I watched him disappear into his office, and I thought about the meeting I hadn't been told about. The consultant I hadn't been introduced to. The VP I'd never met. I thought about the folder I couldn't access. And I opened a new document on my personal laptop, one that wasn't connected to the company server. I titled it Timeline. Then I began to write. Every meeting I hadn't been invited to. Every name that appeared without introduction. Every decision made without my knowledge. I didn't editorialize. I didn't vent. I just recorded. Because if I was being erased, I wanted to know exactly how it had been done. And I wanted proof. 3 days later, Grant called me into his office. I stood in the doorway. You needed something? He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit. Just for a minute. I sat. He leaned back, fingers steepled, expression carefully neutral. I wanted to check in. See how you're feeling about everything. I kept my face calm. I'm fine. Is there something specific? No. Just, things are shifting a little. You've probably noticed. New people coming in, some restructuring. I wanted to make sure you felt supported. I tilted my head slightly. I appreciate that. I haven't felt unsupported. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Good. That's good. I know transitions can be hard. Transitions? Just organizationally. We're tightening up some processes. You'll still be key to everything, of course. But we're bringing in some additional expertise for a few areas. Like Rachel. His smile tightened. Exactly. She's great. Really sharp. I think you'll work well with her. I nodded slowly. I'm sure I will. He relaxed slightly. Great. I'm glad we're on the same page. I stood. Was there anything else? No. That's all. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and opened my timeline document. I added a new line. Grant confirms restructuring. Call it tightening up processes. Does not specify what that means. Does not mention my role changing. Uses the word transitions without defining it. Then I saved the file and returned to work. That afternoon, I received an email from HR. The subject line, reminder, annual review scheduling. I opened it. My review had been moved. Originally scheduled for next month, it was now pushed to the end of the quarter, 3 months away. No explanation. Just a calendar update. I stared at the screen. Then I forwarded the email to my personal account, added the details to my timeline, and closed my laptop. I was starting to see the shape of it now. The slow erasure. The polite distance. The reassurances that meant nothing. They were preparing to let me go. But they wanted me to leave quietly. Voluntarily, if possible. Without questions. Without fuss. I wasn't going to give them that. I was going to stay. And I was going to watch. The watching became methodical. I started arriving earlier, 6:30 instead of 7:30. The building was different at that hour. Quieter. The cleaning crew finishing their rounds, security guards switching shifts, the hum of HVAC systems the only constant sound. I used my access card to move through floors I didn't normally visit, noting which offices had lights on, which doors were already unlocked. I wasn't paranoid. I was deliberate. On Thursday morning, I found Rachel in the third-floor conference room at 6:45, laptop open, papers spread across the table. She looked up when I passed, surprised. Elena. You're here early. I paused in the doorway. So are you. She laughed, a little awkward. Grant wanted me to review these lease structures before the operations meeting. Trying to get ahead of it. The operations meeting, I repeated carefully. This morning? At 9. You'll be there, right? I smiled. I wasn't aware there was one scheduled. Her expression flickered, just slightly. Confusion, maybe embarrassment. Oh. I mean, Grant said you managed his calendar. I do. Then. She trailed off, clearly uncertain how to finish. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I nodded toward her papers. Lease structures are complicated. If you need any background on the tenants, I have files going back 4 years. That would actually be really helpful. I'll send them over. I left before she could say anything else. Back at my desk, I opened Grant's calendar. There was no 9 a.m. meeting listed. I checked the conference room booking system. 3rd floor, conference room B, 9 to 10:30. Reserved by Damon Cross. Not Grant. I sat very still. Then I checked Damon's calendar, accessible because I still had administrative permissions across senior leadership. The meeting was there. Attendees: Grant Holloway, Rachel Penner, Damon Cross, and 2 names I recognized from the building's ownership group. Not me. I took a slow breath, minimized the window, and pulled up the lease files Rachel had requested. I sent them with a brief, professional note, then added another entry to my timeline. Operations meeting scheduled without my knowledge. Rachel assumes I'll attend. I'm not listed as an attendee. Meeting organized by Damon Cross, not Grant. Ownership group involved. I reread the last line twice. Ownership group. That was new. I opened the building directory and searched for Damon Cross's full profile. VP of Strategic Assets, reporting directly to the ownership consortium. His role description was vague: portfolio optimization, asset performance review, strategic realignment. Corporate language meant very little. Or meant everything. I pulled up the building's operational reports from the last 6 months. Occupancy rates, tenant turnover, lease renewals, compliance audits. I'd generated most of these reports myself. I knew the numbers intimately. Occupancy was strong. 92%. Tenant satisfaction scores were high. We'd had 2 minor compliance issues in the past year, both resolved quickly. The building was profitable, stable, well managed. So why was strategic assets involved? I heard the elevator chime. Voices in the hallway. I glanced at the clock. 8:50. I closed my reports, stood, and walked to the break room. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't want and stood by the window, watching the street below. At 9:15, Grant emerged from the elevator with Damon Cross. They were deep in conversation, both holding folders. Rachel followed a few steps behind, nodding at something Damon said. They turned toward the conference room. Grant glanced in my direction as he passed the break room. Our eyes met for less than a second. He didn't stop walking. I sipped my tea and waited. The meeting ran until 11. I tracked it by watching people come and go, bathroom breaks, coffee refills, hushed phone calls in the hallway. At one point, I heard raised voices through the closed door. Not angry, but emphatic. Someone disagreeing. When the door finally opened, the ownership representatives left first, expressions unreadable. Damon followed, phone already to his ear. Rachel came out last, looking drained. Grant stayed inside. I gave it 5 minutes, then walked past the conference room. The door was still closed, but through the glass panel I could see him sitting alone at the head of the table, staring at something on his laptop. I didn't knock. I went back to my desk and waited. He returned 20 minutes later, jacket off, tie loosened. He dropped into his office chair and closed the door without a word. I didn't ask how the meeting went. At 3 o'clock, my phone rang. Internal line. Grant. Elena, can you come in for a second? I grabbed my notebook and walked into his office. He looked tired. Older, somehow, than he had that morning. I need you to pull together some documentation, he said. All tenant correspondence from the last 2 years. Complaints, maintenance requests, lease negotiations. Everything. I wrote it down. For what purpose? He hesitated. Just an internal review. Of what, specifically? His jaw tightened. Does it matter? I met his gaze. It helps me know what to prioritize. He exhaled slowly. Operations efficiency. They want to see how we've been handling tenant relations. I said. Ownership. I nodded. I'll have it ready by the end of the week. Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow's Friday. That's 48 hours for 2 years of correspondence across 63 tenants. I know what I'm asking. I held his gaze a moment longer. I'll do what I can. Thank you. I turned to leave. Elena. I stopped. I know this is a lot. I appreciate you. I didn't respond. I walked back to my desk, opened my file system, and began pulling records. It took me until midnight. I exported every email, work order, lease amendment, and complaint log into a single master file, organized by tenant, chronologically sorted, cross-referenced with resolution dates and outcomes. I included summary notes on recurring issues, outstanding requests, and tenant satisfaction trends. It was far more than he'd asked for. But I wanted him to see that I knew this building better than anyone. I uploaded it to the shared drive and sent him a notification email, timestamped 12:17 a.m. Then I went home, slept 4 hours, and came back at 6. The file had been downloaded at 7:30. By Grant. And by Damon Cross. I stared at the access log. Damon had viewed it twice. Once at 7:43. Again at 8:09. I opened my timeline and added the details. Then I sat back and tried to think. They were reviewing operations. Tenant relations. Efficiency. Strategic assets was involved. Ownership was asking questions. I pulled up Damon's employment file again and scanned his previous roles. He'd spent 12 years in corporate real estate restructuring. His specialty was underperforming assets, identifying inefficiencies, cutting costs, improving margins. Or preparing properties for sale. My chest tightened. I minimized the window and stared at my desk. If they were planning to sell the building, they'd need everything airtight. Clean financials. Happy tenants. No liabilities. And they'd need someone to blame if anything went wrong. I thought about the folder I couldn't access. The meetings I wasn't invited to. The consultant brought in to review my work. I thought about Grant's reassurances. His careful distance. They weren't phasing me out. They were building a case. I stood abruptly, walked to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and let myself feel it. Not panic. Not fear. Anger. Cold, clarifying, useful anger. I'd given 3 years to this building. I knew every tenant, every system, every clause in every contract. I'd fixed problems before they became crises, mediated disputes, ensured compliance with regulations most people didn't even know existed. And now I was being positioned as a liability. I washed my hands, dried them slowly, and looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't look like someone about to be erased. I looked calm. I went back to my desk and opened a new browser window. I searched for corporate real estate transactions in the city over the last 18 months. Sales, acquisitions, portfolio shifts. 3 buildings similar to ours had sold in the past year. All to the same investment group, Apex Holdings. I searched for Apex Holdings. Private equity. Specializing in commercial real estate repositioning. Known for aggressive cost restructuring and rapid turnarounds. I clicked on their leadership page. And there, listed as senior advisor, was a name I recognized. Damon Cross. I closed the browser. Then I opened my personal email and sent myself every file I'd compiled over the past 3 weeks. The timeline. The access logs. The tenant records. Everything. I wasn't going to be caught unprepared. That afternoon, Grant called me into his office again. "I read through your report," he said. "It's thorough." "Thank you." "Maybe too thorough." I tilted my head slightly. "I'm not sure what that means." He leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "You included notes on unresolved maintenance requests. Tenant complaints that are still pending. Issues with vendor delays." "Yes." "You asked for everything." "I asked for correspondence. Not editorializing." "Those aren't editorials. They're facts." His expression hardened. "They make us look disorganized. They make us look honest." Silence. He sat back. "Ownership doesn't need to see our dirty laundry, Elena." "Then maybe you should have specified what you wanted me to hide." His eyes flashed. "I didn't ask you to hide anything. I asked you to use discretion." "Discretion," I repeated. "You mean omission." "I mean professionalism." I stood. "Is there anything else?" He stared at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head. I walked out. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From control. Because I'd just made him show his hand. And now I knew exactly what this was. I went back to my desk, opened my timeline, and wrote. "Grant criticizes my report for being too accurate. Asks me to omit unresolved issues to present a cleaner picture to ownership. Confirms they don't want transparency, they want optics." I saved the file. Then I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I left early. I walked out at 4:30, took the subway home, and sat in my apartment with the lights off, staring at nothing. I thought about loyalty. About competence. About the belief that doing good work would protect me. I thought about how easily I'd been discarded. And I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. I had never been valued. I had been useful. And the moment my usefulness became inconvenient, I became disposable. I sat there until the room went dark. Then I turned on the lamp, opened my laptop, and began to research. Corporate ownership structures. Building acquisitions. Asset transfers. I wanted to know exactly who owned the building I'd spent 3 years protecting. It took me 2 hours. The ownership group was a shell, 3 limited liability companies layered over each other, obscuring the actual investors. But if you traced the filings carefully, the names eventually surfaced. One of them was Damon Cross. He didn't just work for the ownership group. He was the ownership group. Or at least part of it. I stared at my screen. Then I laughed. Not from humor. From disbelief. They were preparing to sell the building to themselves. A restructuring deal designed to look like an external acquisition, allowing them to cut costs, remove liabilities, and flip the asset for profit. And I, careful, competent, invisible Elena, was in the way. I closed my laptop. I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt awake. I spent the weekend building a map. Not literally. But close enough. I printed out organizational charts, ownership documents, email chains, access logs, everything I'd quietly collected over the past month. I spread them across my living room floor and began connecting the pieces. Damon Cross wasn't just advising the ownership group. He was embedded in it. His name appeared on 3 different LLCs tied to the building's financial structure. He'd been positioned as VP of Strategic Assets 6 months ago, right around the time the first whispers of restructuring would have begun internally. Rachel Penner had been brought in 8 weeks ago. Her contract specified a 4-month engagement, exactly long enough to audit operations, generate reports, and provide cover for personnel changes. Grant's role had shifted too, subtly. 3 months ago, his title changed in the internal directory from Executive VP of Growth Initiatives to Senior Director of Growth Initiatives. A demotion disguised as simplification. He was being managed out too. He just didn't realize it yet. I sat back on my heels and looked at the web of connections I'd laid out. They were going to restructure the building's operations, remove anyone with institutional memory, bring in cheaper replacements, polish the financials, and sell to Apex Holdings. A company Damon had direct ties to. It was efficient. Almost elegant. And it would have worked if I hadn't been paying attention. I took photos of everything, backed them up in 3 separate locations, then packed it all away. On Monday morning, I arrived at 6:15. The building was dark except for the lobby and the security station. I nodded to Marco as I passed, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and walked directly to the records room. I had access. I'd always had access. Operations Compliance maintained physical archives for regulatory purposes, original lease documents, inspection records, historical correspondence that predated digital systems. No one had thought to revoke my keycard permissions for this room. I unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and began pulling files. Tenant leases from the building's first 5 years of operation. Original purchase agreements. Historical ownership transfers. Documentation that predated Damon, predated Grant, predated everyone currently involved. I wasn't looking for smoking guns. I was looking for baselines. I found them in a filing cabinet labeled Capital Projects 2019 to 2021. Inside were invoices, work orders, and contractor agreements for a major building renovation completed 3 years ago. Electrical upgrades. HVAC overhauls. Façade repairs. The project had cost $4.2 million. It had been financed through a capital improvement loan, co-signed by the ownership group and guaranteed against the building's appraised value. I pulled the loan documents and read them carefully. There was a clause, buried on page 11, that stipulated if the building were sold within 5 years of the loan's origination, the sale price had to meet or exceed a specific threshold to avoid triggering penalty fees and early repayment terms. The loan originated in August 2021. It was now February 2024. They were still inside the 5-year window. I photographed every page, returned the files exactly as I'd found them, and locked the door behind me. Back at my desk, I pulled up the building's most recent appraisal, conducted 6 months ago as part of standard asset review. The appraised value was $8.3 million. The loan threshold was $8.1 million. They had $200,000 of margin. Not much. But enough, if everything looked perfect. Which meant every unresolved maintenance request, every tenant complaint, every operational inefficiency I documented in my report was a potential liability that could drag down the appraisal and put them under threshold. That's why Grant had been angry. I hadn't just been thorough. I'd been dangerous. I opened my timeline and added a new section. I titled it Leverage. Then I went back to work. At 9:30, Rachel stopped by my desk. She looked uncomfortable. Hey. Do you have a minute? I minimized my screen. Of course. She glanced toward Grant's office, door closed, then back to me. I just wanted to say. I don't think I handled our conversation last week very well. About the operations meeting. You were fine. I wasn't. I assumed you'd be there, and I should have checked. I didn't mean to make things awkward. I studied her for a moment. She seemed genuine. Or she was very good at seeming genuine. It's not your fault, I said carefully. Communication has been inconsistent lately. She nodded, relief crossing her face. Okay. Good. I know transitions are hard, and I don't want to step on anyone's toes. Transitions, I repeated. She hesitated. That's what Grant called it. Did he explain what's transitioning? Not really. Just that the building's going through some operational adjustments. Tightening things up. I smiled. That's one way to put it. She frowned slightly. Is there another way? I held her gaze. How much do you know about Damon Cross? Her expression shifted, just barely. He's VP of Strategic Assets. Why? Do you know what Strategic Assets actually does? Portfolio optimization, I think. Do you know who owns the building? She blinked. The ownership group. I've seen their names on the. Do you know who owns the ownership group? Silence. I leaned forward slightly. Rachel, do you know why you were hired? To review lease structures. Tenant relations. Operational efficiency. And after you finish that review, what happens? I deliver my report, I guess. Then my contract ends. And what do you think they'll do with your report? She stared at me. I don't. I mean, I assume they'll use it to improve things. Or to justify firing people. Her face went pale. I sat back. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just telling you what I've figured out. You seem like a good person. I don't think you signed up to be part of this. Part of what? A restructuring designed to increase sale value by cutting costs and removing anyone who might ask inconvenient questions. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Looked toward Grant's office again. Elena. You don't have to believe me. But you should ask yourself why they hired an external consultant instead of using internal expertise. And you should ask yourself what happens to people like me once people like you deliver reports that justify our removal. I turned back to my screen. She stood there for another moment, then walked away without another word. I didn't feel guilty. I felt strategic. That afternoon, I received an email from HR. Subject, one-on-one check-in request. I opened it. Hi Elena. We're scheduling informal check-ins with team members as part of our ongoing commitment to employee engagement and satisfaction. Would you be available for a 30-minute conversation this Thursday at 2 p.m.? Best. Kendra Yates. HR Generalist. I read it 3 times. Informal. Engagement. Satisfaction. Corporate euphemisms for we need to document that we tried to support you before we let you go. I replied immediately. Hi Kendra. Thursday at 2 works for me. Should I prepare anything in advance? Best. Elena. Her response came back within 10 minutes. No preparation needed. This is just a chance to talk. I added the meeting to my calendar and my timeline. Then I opened a new document and began drafting questions. I wasn't going to make this easy. Thursday arrived. I dressed carefully that morning. Professional, but not defensive. I wanted to look like someone who had nothing to hide. At 2 o'clock, I walked into the small conference room on the 2nd floor where Kendra was waiting. She smiled warmly as I sat down. Thanks for making time, Elena. Of course. She opened her laptop. So this is really just a conversation. Nothing formal. We're checking in with folks across the organization to see how everyone's feeling, if there's anything we can support with, that kind of thing. I nodded. That sounds helpful. Great. So let me start with an easy one. How are you finding your role lately? Any changes or challenges you want to talk through? I paused, as if considering. I think the biggest challenge has been navigating communication gaps. Communication gaps? Meetings I'm not included in. Decisions made without context. It's made it harder to do my job effectively. She typed something. Can you give me an example? I wasn't informed about Rachel Penner's hiring until after she'd started. I also wasn't told about the operations review meeting 2 weeks ago, even though my work was being discussed. Okay. And have you raised these concerns with Grant? I've tried. He's been reassuring, but vague. She nodded slowly. How would you describe your working relationship with Grant overall? It was strong for a long time. Recently, it feels more distant. Do you feel supported in your role? I met her eyes. No. She blinked. Can you elaborate? I feel like I'm being managed around instead of managed. I feel like decisions are being made about my work without my input. And I feel like I'm being positioned as a problem instead of a resource. She stopped typing. That's a serious concern. It is. Have you considered that these changes might not be about you personally? Sometimes organizational shifts mean processes change, and... Kendra, I said quietly. I've worked here for 3 years. I know this building inside and out. I know the tenants, the systems, the history. And I know when I'm being phased out. Silence. She looked at her screen, then back at me. What would make you feel more supported? Transparency. Clear communication. And not being excluded from decisions that directly affect my work. She nodded. I'll make a note of that. Will you? Her expression flickered. Of course. And will it matter? She didn't answer right away. Then she closed her laptop. Elena, I can't speak to decisions above my level. But I can document this conversation and make sure your concerns are heard. Heard, I repeated. But not addressed. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. She exhaled slowly. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Just one thing. If this is truly about engagement and satisfaction, why is my annual review delayed by 3 months? She went very still. I'd have to check on that. I already did. It was moved the same week Rachel Penner started. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. I'm sure there is too. I stood. Thank you for your time, Kendra. She stood as well, looking unsettled. Elena, I hope you know we value your contributions. I'm sure you'll document that thoroughly. I walked out. Back at my desk, I updated my timeline with detailed notes from the meeting. Every question she'd asked. Every deflection. Then I opened my email and drafted a message to myself, summarizing the conversation and attaching it to my growing file. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was building a record. That night, I stayed late again. Not to work. To watch. At 7:30, Damon Cross arrived. I saw him on the security monitor at my desk. He'd passed through the lobby and taken the elevator to the 5th floor. The 5th floor was mostly empty. A few vacant offices. Storage. The old server room we no longer used. I waited 10 minutes, then took the stairs. The hallway was dark except for emergency lighting. I moved quietly, checking doors. Most were locked. But one was open. I heard voices inside. Low, controlled. I moved closer and recognized them immediately. Damon. And Grant. I couldn't make out full sentences, but I caught fragments. Final numbers by end of month. Appraisal contingency. Can't afford any surprises. I pressed myself against the wall and listened. She's a problem. That was Damon. A pause. Then Grant, she's thorough. That's not the same thing. It is when thorough means liability. We can't have her documentation floating around during due diligence. So what do you want me to do? Manage it. Manage her. Or we will. Silence. Then Grant, give me 2 weeks. You have 1. I heard movement. I turned and walked quickly back toward the stairwell, slipping through the door just as the office opened behind me. I took the stairs down, heart pounding, and exited on the 3rd floor. I walked calmly to my desk, gathered my things, and left through the main entrance. Marco looked up. "Night, Ms. Ward." "Good night, Marco." I stepped into the cold and walked 3 blocks before I let myself stop. Then I leaned against a brick wall and let out a long, shaking breath. They were going to fire me. Within a week. And they were going to make sure none of my documentation survived. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the traffic passing by. Then I pulled out my phone and made a call. It rang 4 times before a voice answered. "Michael Cho, how can I help you?" "Michael, it's Elena Ward. We worked together on the Riverside compliance audit 2 years ago." "Elena." "Of course. What's going on?" "I need a lawyer." Michael Cho met me at a coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment the next morning at 6:30. He looked exactly as I remembered, sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. He ordered black coffee. I ordered nothing. "Tell me what's happening," he said. I laid it out. Clearly. Chronologically. No emotion, just facts. The meetings I'd been excluded from. The consultant brought in to audit my work. The ownership structure I'd uncovered. The loan threshold. The conversation I'd overheard. He took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he set down his pen. "You're sure about the ownership connection? Damon Cross is embedded in the LLC structure?" "I have the documents." "And you have records of everything you've described? The exclusions, the communications, the timeline?" "Extensively documented." He nodded slowly. "What do you want?" I met his eyes. "I want to not be erased." "That's defensive." "What do you want offensively?" I paused. I hadn't let myself think that far ahead. I'd been so focused on survival, on documentation, on proving I wasn't paranoid. "I want them to know they can't do this quietly," I said finally. "That's closer. But still reactive." He leaned forward. "Elena, you're sitting on a significant amount of leverage. The question isn't whether you can protect yourself. The question is what you want to do with the position you're in." "I don't understand." "You have documented evidence of a potentially fraudulent restructuring designed to artificially inflate asset value before sale. You have proof of undisclosed conflicts of interest. You have records of retaliatory behavior. That's not just an HR problem. That's a legal problem. Possibly a regulatory problem." I stared at him. "If you want to fight a wrongful termination claim, we can do that. It'll be messy, take months, and you'll probably get a settlement that comes with a non-disclosure agreement." He paused. "Or we can go a different direction." "What direction?" "You said there's a loan threshold they're trying to stay above. 8.1 million. And the current appraisal is 8.3. "Yes." "What happens if that appraisal drops?" I thought about it. The sale falls apart. Or they have to trigger the penalty clauses. Either way, it's no longer profitable. And what controls the appraisal? Building conditions. Tenant satisfaction. Operational performance. Compliance status. All things you have intimate knowledge of. I understood what he was suggesting. "You want me to sabotage them?" "No. I want you to stop protecting them." He tapped his notepad. "You've been maintaining this building impeccably for 3 years. You've covered gaps, resolved issues, managed problems before they escalated. You've been making them look competent. That's my job. It was your job. Now your job is to watch the reality show." I sat back. "That feels unethical? Dangerous?" "It's neither. You're not creating problems. You're just stopping the quiet management of existing ones." You're withdrawing your labor, the invisible labor they've been taking for granted. They'll fire me. They're already going to fire me. This just changes the timing and the terms. He closed his notebook. But I'm not advising you to do anything. I'm laying out options. You get to decide what kind of ending you want. I looked out the window. The sun was rising over the buildings across the street, cold light cutting through the gray sky. If I do this, I said quietly, I need to do it carefully. Agreed. And I need protection. That's why you called me. I turned back to him. What's your retainer? For you? Let's start with a documentation review. Get me everything you have. I'll assess the legal position and we'll go from there. He slid a business card across the table. My secure email is on there. Send it encrypted if you can. I took the card. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This could get complicated. It already is. He smiled slightly. Fair point. I went to work. I arrived at my usual time, made coffee, checked emails, and updated Grant's calendar. I responded to routine requests with routine efficiency. But I stopped doing the invisible things. A tenant emailed about a recurring electrical issue in their suite. Normally, I would have forwarded it to maintenance, followed up, ensured resolution, and updated the tenant directly. Instead, I forwarded it to Grant with a brief note, FYI. Tenant issue requiring attention. I didn't follow up. Another tenant called about a lease renewal deadline they'd missed by 3 days. Normally, I would have quietly extended it, updated the paperwork, and prevented a gap in occupancy. Instead, I transferred them to the leasing office and noted the gap in the occupancy report. A vendor invoice came through with an error that would have delayed payment and damaged our relationship. Normally, I would have caught it, corrected it, and processed it smoothly. Instead, I filed it as received. I wasn't sabotaging. I was simply not compensating. And within 48 hours, the cracks started showing. Grant's calendar was double-booked because I didn't catch a scheduling conflict. He missed a call with a board member. A compliance report went out with outdated data because I didn't cross-check it against the latest inputs. The building inspection scheduled for next week. One I would normally have prepared extensively for, remained unprepared. On Wednesday morning, I never heard what happened to Grant or Damon after they resigned. I didn't look them up. I didn't follow the building's sale process. I didn't need closure from them. I'd found it in myself. In the quiet certainty that I hadn't won by destroying anyone. I'd won by refusing to disappear. And sometimes, that's the only victory that matters. The kind no one can take away. The kind you carry with you, long after the story ends.